In the winter of 1882, a structural surveyor named Edmund Garfield Holt walked onto the scaffolding surrounding the dome of the Allegheny County Courthouse in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and stood for nearly 40 minutes without writing a single note. He had been hired to assess the stability of the copper lantern assembly at the peak of the dome, specifically the large gilded orb that had crowned it since the building's completion in 1851. He carried a brass plumb bob, a leather-bound measurement ledger, and a letter of authorization stamped with 3 different government seals. The scaffolding creaked in the January wind. He later wrote that the orb was in perfect structural condition, not hairline fractured, not corroded at the mounting ring, not dangerous to the building beneath it or to the public below. The copper surface showed the oxidation you would expect after 3 decades of exposure. The mounting hardware was sound. The seams were intact. By the time Holt filed his official report 7 weeks later, the orb had already been removed. No replacement was ever installed. The lantern room that remained looked, in the words of one Pittsburgh newspaper from March of 1882, as though the building had been decapitated. The report itself, a 188-page assessment with 11 photographic plates, including close-range images of the orb's mounting ring taken from the scaffolding, was transferred to the Bureau of Construction Records in Washington in the spring of 1883. It has not appeared in any publicly searchable federal archive since that transfer was logged. The only surviving evidence that the report existed at all is a single line in a shipping ledger held at the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, which records the crating and transport of official documents to Washington and lists Holt's assessment by its reference number. The official story, the one you will find in architectural histories and historic preservation pamphlets, is that the orbs came down because they were structurally unsound. Decorative excess, a hazard in high winds, the product of an earlier, more flamboyant era of American civic architecture that the post-Civil War government had matured beyond. That is what the record says. What the record does not explain is why this happened everywhere, simultaneously within a window of roughly 8 years, and why the structures beneath the orbs were never modified in any other substantive way. A genuine hazard removal program does not typically leave the lantern room, the drum, the ribs, the fenestrated base, and the entire substructure of a dome completely untouched. You remove the hazard. You do not remove only the crown and leave everything else exactly as it stood. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as compelling as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what Edmund Holt was really looking at on that scaffolding, you have to go back, not just to the 1850s when these domes were built. You have to go back to a period of American civic construction that mainstream architectural historians have quietly folded into a much simpler story than the surviving evidence actually supports. Between 1820 and 1875, the United States constructed an extraordinary number of monumental public buildings, courthouses, state capitals, customs houses, post offices, federal land offices, and municipal halls that shared a very specific vocabulary of design. Raised domes over central rotundas, colonnaded exteriors, symmetrical fenestration, and consistently, a crowning element at the apex, a lantern, and above the lantern, an orb, sometimes gilded copper, sometimes painted cast iron, sometimes pure hammered bronze. The orb varied in size from building to building, but its placement did not. It was always at the highest accessible point of the structure, always at the apex, always unobstructed from above. The orb was not purely decorative. This is the detail that conventional architectural history passes over too quickly. In the neoclassical and late Baroque European civic tradition from which these American buildings directly descended, the orb at the apex of a civic dome carried a specific meaning that had nothing to do with aesthetics. It was understood as a point of collection, a terminus for what natural philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries called the etheric current, the energy that was believed to move through the atmosphere and could, under the right conditions, be gathered, directed, and distributed through a properly constructed building. This was not considered mystical in the way we might now frame it. It was considered practical. It was discussed in the same registers as hydraulics and thermal management. That interpretation is not fringe speculation. It appears in the published architectural writings of Robert Mills, the man who designed the Washington Monument, the Treasury Building, and several federal courthouses, who described the apex elements of civic domes as intended to stand in productive relationship with the atmosphere above them. He wrote, in an 1836 technical address to the American Institute of Architects, that the terminating element of any civic dome should be understood as the structure's point of highest sensitivity, the place where the building made its most direct contact with the forces above it. He did not elaborate further in the published version of that address. A longer manuscript draft of the same address, held at the Library of Congress, contains 3 additional paragraphs on this subject. Those paragraphs were excised before publication. The manuscript shows the removal clearly. The pages are present, the paragraphs are crossed through in a different ink, and a notation in the margin reads simply, "Not for inclusion." The same thread appears in the 1847 correspondence of Thomas Yu. Walter, the architect who oversaw the construction of the current cast-iron dome of the United States Capitol, who wrote in a letter to the Commissioner of Public Buildings that the positioning of the lantern and finial of the Capitol dome followed principles that, in his words, predated the current republic by several centuries. He named no source for those principles. He did not explain what they were. The letter ends with a sentence that reads, "The apex must be considered not as a terminus, but as an origin." Those letters are held at the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. They are catalogued. They are accessible to researchers. They are never quoted in any published history of the Capitol dome's construction. The one scholar who cited them directly, an architectural historian at Columbia University writing in 1961, saw his chapter on the dome's design philosophy cut from the final publication by his editor. He noted the removal in a letter to a colleague. That letter is in the Columbia University Rare Book and Manuscript Library. By the early 1880s, the orbs began to disappear, not from one building in one city, for one documented reason, from dozens across the country within the span of less than a decade. The Rhode Island State House orb was removed in 1881. The official documentation cited wind damage. The stone lantern room below the removed element showed no structural evidence of wind damage when independently assessed 6 months later by an engineer working for the building's insurance underwriter. The Ohio State House lantern assembly, which had included a copper sphere at its apex since the building's completion in 1861, was modified in 1883. A new finial was installed in place of the sphere, pointed, not spherical, oriented vertically rather than presenting a rounded collection surface to the sky. The superintendent of the replacement project, a man named Charles Weller, submitted a cost estimate to the state legislature that included a line item described only as apparatus disassembly and transport. The estimate was approved in 48 hours by a federal office in Washington that had no formal jurisdiction over Ohio state property. The Customs House in New Orleans, a massive federal building that had been under construction in phases for more than 3 decades, had its dome design altered mid-construction in 1882. The original blueprints, which survive in the Architectural Archive at Tulane University, show a prominent orb finial at the apex of the central dome. The revised blueprints submitted to and approved by the Treasury Department that same year do not. No letter, no memorandum, and no formal change order explaining why the revision was made has ever been located in any archive. Cincinnati, 1880. The crowning orb removed from the Hamilton County Courthouse during what the City Council minutes describe as routine maintenance, though no maintenance allocation for that element appears anywhere in the preceding 3 budget cycles. Louisville, 1881. The apex sphere of the Jefferson County Courthouse dismantled during a renovation that otherwise left every other element of the dome completely intact, including wooden decorative elements that genuinely had deteriorated over decades and which received no attention whatsoever. Detroit, 1882. The spherical lantern cap of the Wayne County building replaced with a flat copper plate. The work completed over a single weekend when the building was closed and no city maintenance staff were present. Utica, New York, 1883. The gilded ball finial of the Oneida County Courthouse removed and reportedly melted down. Though no foundry receipt, no material accounting, and no record of where that metal was directed has been found in any municipal archive. In each of these cases, the official record cites structural assessment. In each case, independent engineering surveys conducted during the same period, surveys completed for property insurance purposes rather than for government documentation, found the relevant structures to be sound. But here is what makes Edmund Holt's account different from every other piece of evidence in this pattern. In the spring of 1897, 15 years after he filed the assessment that preceded the Pittsburgh Orbs removal, Holt gave a single interview to a Pittsburgh trade publication called the Builders Monthly. He was 71 years old and recently retired from active practice. He had not spoken publicly about the 1882 assessment in the intervening years. What he said in that interview has a specificity that is unusual for a man recounting events from a decade and a half prior. He said that when he stood on that scaffolding in January of 1882, he had not been alone. 2 men had accompanied him who did not appear on the project roster and who had not been introduced to him in advance of the inspection. He described them as representatives of what he called the Federal Commission on Public Structures, an office he had never encountered before that morning and never dealt with again in 15 more years of practice. He said these men carried equipment he could not identify. Brass instruments, he described them, with glass elements and calibrated dials that resembled neither surveying instruments nor barometers, nor any electrical testing device he had seen. He said the 2 men spent approximately 35 minutes in direct contact with the orb's mounting ring while he stood back on the scaffold platform. At the end of that time, one of the men made a notation in a small red ledger. The other said simply that the element would need to come down. Holt said he asked why. The man told him the orb was no longer in a condition suitable for its original purpose. Holt wrote that he did not know what that phrase meant. He asked for clarification. No clarification was given. The Federal Commission on Public Structures does not appear in any published directory of federal agencies from the 1880s. It does not appear in the congressional record during the relevant years. It does not appear in the Treasury Department's organizational charts, which were the primary oversight body for federal public works at that time. It does appear in one other surviving document, a handwritten reference in the 1884 correspondence of James G. Hill, the supervising architect of the Treasury, who wrote in a letter to an unidentified recipient, "The name has been cut from the surviving copy, a clean cut, not deterioration, that all apex element assessments had been completed to the satisfaction of the Commission, and that the program was proceeding on the agreed schedule." An agreed schedule? not a case-by-case structural review conducted independently by different cities and counties across 12 states. A schedule, agreed in advance, coordinated from somewhere above the level of any individual building authority. The Treasury Department has never adequately addressed several specific questions that arise from this period of the documentary record. It has never explained why the internal correspondence directing the removal of orb elements from state and county buildings, structures that were not under federal jurisdiction and whose maintenance was the explicit legal responsibility of state and local governments, was routed through the office of the supervising architect of the Treasury rather than through any state authority. It is never explained why the 188-page Holt assessment of the Pittsburgh Courthouse dome, officially transferred to the Bureau of Construction Records in 1883 and logged in a shipping ledger that still exists, does not appear in any of the Bureau's surviving catalogs from the period between 1883 and 1900. It has never explained what the Federal Commission on Public Structures was, under what authority it was constituted, who appointed its representatives, or when it ceased operations. There is a growing body of independent research suggesting that the official history of American civic architecture in the period between 1840 and 1890 contains gaps that mainstream architectural historians have not seriously engaged with. Researchers examining daguerreotypes, early photographic surveys, and insurance assessment imagery of American cities taken before 1880 have identified more than 200 public buildings bearing apex orb elements that do not appear in the construction records of the firms documented as having built them, not referenced in the city council appropriations that funded the buildings, not mentioned in the architect's project correspondence, present in the photographs, absent from the paper trail. This is the context in which Edmund Holt's 1897 testimony becomes something considerably more than the recollection of one retired surveyor about one unusual inspection on one cold morning in Pittsburgh. There is a second witness, whose account has never appeared in any mainstream history of this period. A woman named Clara Beckett, whose husband was a journeyman electrician contracted to run new interior conduit through the Cincinnati Customs House during a lighting retrofit completed in 1886, wrote in her personal diary, a document now held in the collection of the Cincinnati Historical Society, that her husband came home one evening in considerable agitation and described what he had found while threading conduit through the interior of the building's dome. He had broken through to a cavity that did not appear on any blueprint he had been given. He described it as a vertical channel, running from the inner apex of the dome downward through multiple floors of the structure. It was lined with copper sheeting, he told her. It was terminated at a subfloor level with what appeared to be a collection basin fitted with a drainage aperture. He asked the project foreman what the channel was. He was told it was a historic rainwater drainage system, an old design now obsolete, and that he should root around it and say nothing about it in his work notes. He included it in his work notes. Those notes were collected by the project supervisor at the end of that working week. They were never returned to him. He asked for them twice. He was told both times that the notes were under review. He never saw them again. He did not pursue the matter further. He had a family. He needed the work. Clara Beckett recorded that he told her, "A man learns quickly which questions are safe to ask twice." Clara Beckett wrote that her husband described the channel as something that had plainly been designed to carry something downward from the apex of the roof, to receive something from above and move it into the building's interior. He did not know what, but he told her that the apex of the dome, at the point where the channel met the exterior surface, bore a mounting ring. A heavy mounting ring, copper-faced, with bolt holes that had been filled with lead plugs. Something had been attached to that ring, something that had come down. He had seen the same ring on 2 other buildings in the city. They were all empty. The official history tells us that the crowning orbs of America's pre-1880 civic domes were removed for structural and aesthetic reasons. Practical decisions by a maturing republic shedding the ornamental excesses of a more exuberant architectural era. What the witnesses tell us, what the missing documents suggest, and what the physical evidence still present in the sealed mounting rings of surviving domes across this country points towards is something considerably more deliberate. A program, a schedule agreed in advance, a commission with no entry in the public record directing the systematic removal of elements from the highest points of the buildings that house the official functions of American civic life. Courts, customs, government, within a compressed window of time in the early 1880s, from which the documentary trail then goes quiet. What those elements were doing in the decades before they came down is the question the record has not been made to answer. What they were built to receive, to collect, to conduct into the structures beneath them, that is the thread that every document transfer, every missing report, every line cut from a letter has worked to ensure you do not pull. These stories survive because people refuse to stop asking. If you have made it this far, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects this removal program to a set of patents filed between 1872 and 1879. Patents for atmospheric collection devices, filed under names that appear nowhere else in the American scientific record. One of those patents was formally withdrawn from public registration in 1881, the year before the schedule began.